I've been to Israel now, I think 3 or 4 times, and I love Israel. However, how many have ever been to Israel? It's okay if you haven't. A couple of you, so you get this. And in Jerusalem, Jerusalem is not typically what you would think Jerusalem is. Jerusalem is a hodgepodge of everything. You have Hasidic Jews who are praying at the Wailing Wall with the long curls and dancing with the Torah scrolls. You have various sects of Islam. You have evangelicals. You have Armenian Christians. You have Roman Orthodox Christians, and it's prolific how many people from different cultures all kind of descend upon Jerusalem. To give you an example of the diversity we find in Jerusalem, a couple of years ago, I was sitting in the Arab Quarter eating Jewish lamb next to my Iraqi cab driver, being waited on by a Palestinian waitress, and drinking a United States Coca-Cola while having a Turkish coffee. That's Jerusalem in the nutshell. And I think the reason people descend upon Jerusalem is they are trying to find what truth is. They all have a version of their scriptures. For the Muslim, it is the Quran. For the Christian, it's the Bible. For the Jew, it's the Torah, right? And so everybody's trying to figure out what truth is. And it was the same in Jesus's day. Jesus's day was not populated with just solely Jewish people. We know because on the day of Pentecost, you have people from every walk of life in Jerusalem. And they're doing the same thing. They're trying to figure out what truth is. And so back in Jesus's day, what they would do is they would gather for themselves a rabbi. A rabbi was just simply a teacher, and rabbis came from all walks of life. They were carpenters, they were fishermen, they were stonemasons, they were farmers, and they were experts in the Torah, and they would begin to teach their version of the Torah, and they would gather an audience, and people would begin to follow them. Jesus wasn't unique in that way. He was a rabbi walking through a countryside and teaching his version of the Torah. That's why the Sermon on the Mount is his version of the Torah. When he says the kingdom of God is like, he is teaching in that moment his version of what God's law really is. So rabbis were pretty prolific. And all of them would teach this way that if you're going to follow me, you must walk in my footsteps. And even sometimes it was very, very literal. Now, Pastor Mark, pastor at Visalia First, and I have worked together for 20 plus years. He married Rachel and I 21 years ago. His children were in my children's ministry when I was a children's pastor. His daughter was my children's pastor when I pastored in Dallas. Now I'm back working with him again. And he always says that my mannerisms, the way I talk, the way I preach, the way I act in the pulpit are almost identical to my youth pastor 30 years ago, because I was mentored by him. I was developed by him. I walked in his footsteps. And this is the way of the rabbi, really, is you walk in the footsteps of the rabbi. Think of it this way. I have 2 girls. One's almost 18, and I took her to lunch on Friday, and we talked about college and boyfriends and life after college. And I started singing Butterfly Kisses in my head. It was tough. I know, it's really bad. And she was almost 18, and I have a 14-year-old, but when they were younger, they would go to mom's closet. They would put mom's high heels on, and they weren't super high because I wouldn't let her be taller than me. So kind of more flats, if you will. They would grab mom's purse. They'd put on mom's makeup. Sometimes they'd put on mom's dresses because they wanted to be like mom. They wanted to mature and they wanted to grow. They wanted to be just like her. That's the idea of discipleship or disciple. You see, the word disciple is not a verb. It's a noun. It's not something you do. It's something you are. Does that make sense? A lot of times what we do as a church is we do a discipleship program. And as long as you read the book of John and memorize 5 scriptures and learn how to pray 5 minutes a day, you are a disciple. But that's not it. Disciple is not what you do. A disciple is who you are. And I think the number one problem with the American church today, and this is from a guy who works at a large church and have worked at various size churches, but the number one problem in America today is we've done everything we can to produce ministries, to build buildings, to draw crowds, but all at the expense of making disciples. This is why people can come into your church doors, and I've seen them time and time again, no matter how big the church, they can come into the church, they can listen to a message, they can walk out the door, and it never affects them because we have been so focused on developing fans of Jesus and not followers of Jesus. 63%, according to Pew, identify as being Christian. But if you start digging into those numbers, really, George Barna discovered that only 4% of people who claim to be a Christian are actually following Jesus. 4%. No wonder we're in the state that we are in, because we have a lot of fans of Jesus who come in here and they wave their arms. They're like, yay, Jesus, go score that touchdown. And they walk out the door never being challenged, changed, or transformed. And a disciple begins to look like their rabbi. And if you're not beginning to look like Jesus, then you're a fan, not a follower. And Jesus in his day had a lot of fans. He had massive crowds. I mean, if you would understand Jesus, there were times that there were probably 10,000 people walking around him and listening to him and pressing in on him. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people moving in to follow or at least be around Jesus. Now think about 10,000 people. Rachel and I, a couple of weeks ago, went to the Giants game, and they were giving a bobblehead away of Willie Mays. And I didn't know anything about it, but we were meeting a pastor friend who pastors in San Francisco, and he goes, hey, listen, you got to be there at 5:30 because this is an important bobblehead, and you need to be one of the first in the gates, and we get in a line as long as Texas. And I'm sitting there going, we are not going to get this bobblehead. And I knew nothing about the bobblehead, but then I start throwing a fit, like, I really want that bobblehead. I deserve that bobblehead. I've earned that bobblehead. As we stood out in the heat, and it was an unusual day in San Francisco where it's like 90 degrees. And if you've ever been around Oracle, it kind of blocks the ocean breeze as you're standing outside, and I'm pouring down sweat. And can I vent for a second? This lady has the audacity. There's this long line. They're only giving 10,000 out. There's a massive amount of people around me. Massive. And this lady comes up and she starts mouthing at me like that. And I'm like, what? It's my pastoral spirit. What? She goes, can we cut in line? Because my husband will be inconsolable. And Rachel's listening to the story, and Rachel says, I looked at her and I go, no. Like, just like no compassion, like, lady, no. So she goes to the person behind me. Can we cut in line? My husband will be inconsolable. It's just terrible. He won't want to wait in this heat. And the woman says, yes. And so she gets in line, and I'm just, this has nothing to do with the message. This is like confession. I am mad and angry, and I talk about it the rest of the game like, how dare she? How dare she? Why would she even ask that? I mean, I was just mad because there were 10,000 people in line. 10,000 people would fill this place 10 or 20 times. That's how many people were following Jesus. But when we get to John chapter 6, Jesus is on his way to the cross. He's getting closer and closer to the cross, and he's beginning to lay out this idea of what it's going to look like to follow him. Look at John chapter 6, verse 1, and I'm going to kind of read different passages here. John chapter 6, and a large crowd was following him because they saw signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up. Verse 9, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but there are so many. The disciples are coming to him saying, all these people are gathering around us and they're hungry. What are we to do? And Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. So when you add women and children, you're somewhere around 10,000 there. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed it to them, to those who were seated. So they also, also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told their disciples to gather it up, and they gathered 12 basketfuls. But there's a key to the story, and it's in verse 2. A large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. So notice it's immediately apparent that people are showing up because what Jesus was doing for them. He was meeting their needs. And yet something changes in the story when you get down to verse 47. It says, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. This is Jesus talking. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that the Son of Man, I've got totally lost on my notes here, but let's just go down to verse 54. Look what he says. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. Look at verse 60. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, this is a hard saying. Who can listen to this? And after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. So Jesus turned to the 12. So you've gone from 10,000 people to 12. And Jesus looks at him and says, do you want to go away as well? So I want you to notice that in John's gospel, we see this picture of many following Jesus because of what he's doing for them. There's excitement in the crowd. There's energy in the crowd. And much like today, people are following Jesus because what he can do for them in their temporal moment. And yet when we come to passages like John chapter 6 or Luke chapter 14, Jesus's demands become greater and greater and greater. It's almost as if Jesus is taking this massive sifter and sifting people. He's saying, listen, are you following me for the right reasons? Are you following me because I can fill your tummies? American church, are you following Jesus because he can bless you? Are you following Jesus because he provides healing? What are you following him for? What I notice is most of the time we follow him for what he can do for us. You ever notice that? I'm old enough, and most of us are old enough to remember 9/11, yes? You realize how full churches got right after 9/11? They were packed. Why? Because people needed Jesus in that moment. But you go to churches today in New York and they're sparsely attended. Why? Because they no longer need him. And so this picture that Jesus is doing is he's beginning to sift his disciples. Now I want you to look at Luke chapter 14 for a moment. Here's what it says. Jesus uses this metaphor, and listen to what he says. Verse 28, for which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish it, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great arm away off, he sends away a delegation and asks for terms of peace. Verse 33, so therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away, and he who has ears, let him hear. Now here Jesus is using a building metaphor, and Rachel and I have renovated houses. I've renovated churches. I've been a part of church buildings, and I can just tell you that every time we've done this successfully, we've sat down and penciled out everything and go, okay, this is going to cost this is going to cost this is going to cost this. Here's our budget here, here's our budget here, here's our budget here, and making sure everything lines up before we ever step into that. And what Jesus is saying is if you are going to follow him, it's not a flippant decision. It's not a momentary decision that's made off of emotion. It's not an unserious endeavor. Rather, we must count the cost of following him. So what are the costs? Well, there's two that I see from this passage. And the first one is this. There is a relational cost to being a disciple. I want you to just look right above that passage and look at Luke chapter 14, verse 25. Here's what it says. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now that's a confusing passage, isn't it? It seems odd that Jesus would say we must hate our fathers and mothers, especially when we look at the context of Jewish life. When a man would go and propose to his wife, he would propose and then he would go back and he would add a room onto his father's house. Matter of fact, this is what Jesus is doing when he's giving us a picture of heaven. He goes, I go away to prepare a place for you. You remember that passage? That's not a passage about mansions. The picture of heaven is not about us sitting in a mansion, but when Jesus is talking about, I go away and I prepare a place for you and I will bring you back to that place, he's talking about marriage proposal. So your picture of heaven shouldn't be mansions. Your picture of heaven should be relationship with God, intimate like family. That's the metaphor that Jesus is using. And so what he's doing here is when he says you should hate your mothers and brothers and sisters, it seems a little bit confusing considering how close the family unit was in Jewish life. I mean, after all, we have passages that say we are to honor our father and mother. We are to love our wives and our husband as Christ loved the church. We see a Jesus who put children in his arms in Mark chapter 10 and to be reconciled to our brother, all this love stuff. Yet he says you must hate in comparison to your love for me. It's a moment of commitment. You must put everything above or below Jesus. Nothing should ever be above him. That's what he's saying. So if you haven't thought about that, if you haven't leaned into that, if you haven't weighed the relational cost of following Jesus, you need to wait for a moment and consider that. Jesus is saying we need to count the relational cost. But number two, there's a sacrificial cost to being a disciple. Look at Luke chapter 14. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. What does carry the cross mean? Well, in today's modern world, we see the cross as something beautiful, as something holy, as something sacred. But what Jesus is basically saying is you are to carry your own instrument of death and torture. You are to pick it up, pick up that electric chair, pick up that gallows and follow me. You must die is what Jesus is saying. Your will, your ambition, your indulgences, your individualism all dies. And part of the issue we have in the American church is we don't want to die. Our greatest desire in the American culture, the thing that is at the pinnacle of everything else in America right now is my rights. And as a believer, your rights die. Your will dies. Does that make sense? For a disciple, you're to live a life of perpetual deaths. We embrace Christ on his path of self-denial. We see that suffering is a part of life for the disciple. Paul says it this way in Philippians 3, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection. And we all stop there and go, praise God. But we forget to read that we may share in the sufferings, becoming like him in his death. If you are going to follow this Jesus, you're going to have to die. You're going to have to die to everything you have ever wanted or desired. C.S. Lewis says it this way. He says the Christian way is different. Christ says, give me all. I don't want so much of your time, so much of your money, and so much of your work. I want you. I've not come to torment your natural self, but to kill it. No half measures are any good. I don't want to cut off a branch here and a branch there. I want to have the whole tree down. I don't want to drill the tooth or crown it or stop it, but I have to have it out. Hand over your whole natural self, all desires which you think are innocent as well as the ones you think are wicked, the whole outfit. To be a disciple requires everything. There's no exceptions to this. No one has ever become a disciple of Christ and lived a life of ease. You can search all the apostolic writings of the church and you will find no exception. You can check the vignettes that were written in the Reformation or the first 400 years, and it's true that if you are going to be a follower of Jesus and a disciple, then you are not lounging on a bed of constant comfort. It's quiet. But it's true. Jesus' point was that if you're going to follow him, you better count the cost. You know what that word disciple actually renders out to? Apprentice. Apprentice. I, in college, was a plumber's apprentice. I would dig ditches. I'd put pipes together. Don't call me to fix your toilet. It will blow up. But what he was doing is he was teaching me to become just like him. Well, if we're going to follow Jesus, that means we follow him all the way to the cross. We die as he dies, and we resurrect as he resurrects. So there's a relational cost to following Jesus. There's a sacrificial cost to following Jesus. But if you continue to read through Luke chapter 14, disciple is the normative pattern for the Christian. It's a normative pattern. Look what he says, and it seems a bit disconnected. He says, salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for soil or for the manure pile. Throw it away. Seems disconnected. Jesus is kind of laying down the law of what it looks like to be a disciple, and it seems like he almost switches gears. But what he's saying here is that this sacrificial cost, this relational cost, is normal for the believer. Jesus reminds us not to underestimate his claims on our lives. We are to stay salty, lest we be discarded and worthless. To lose saltiness is kind of hard for us to understand because we think of taste, but that's not the case. What's happening here, the metaphor that Jesus is using, is salt didn't lose its taste. Well, what they did in ancient Palestine is they would take salt and they would mix it with filler and it would lose its potency. Have you ever been to one of those shops where they go, hey, you can have this, and they put a little filler in it and it's not really as good? You follow me? This is what Jesus is saying. He's saying a believer who has mixed other things in their saltiness should be discarded. It's all or nothing. There's no Jesus plus this equals Christianity. Anytime you add an adjective to the gospel, you distort the gospel. So you can't mix the things. And so Jesus is basically saying that the pattern here is that you are to be a disciple. If you're going to claim Christ, you must be a disciple, a follower of him. James would say it this way in James 1:22, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourself. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks intently at his face in a mirror. And he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, will be blessed in his doing. So it's not merely this idea of believing, so to speak, it's believing with action. Even Paul, who is all about the gospel of believing in the risen Son of God, would say, walk by the Spirit, meaning that there is some sort of action point that you must be doing. So a disciple understands the relational cost, the sacrificial cost, and understands that it's a normative behavior. But fourthly, being a disciple requires productivity. I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 25. This is Jesus's parable of the talents, and it's rather lengthy, and I'm going to read it for you as we close out today. Jesus says this, for it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away, and he who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug it in the ground and hid his master's money. Verse 19, now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with him. And he who had received 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. And his master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Verse 22. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I've made 2 talents more. And his master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid. I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered, you wicked and slothful or lazy servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to who has 10 talents. For everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away and cast the worthless servant into outer darkness, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So I want you to get this. There's a few observations here that I think are important. Notice the first observation. The wise servant understood their master and the foolish one did not. You see that? The wise immediately went to go to work. And the foolish servant comes up to his master and said, well, I knew you were an angry man. I knew you were harsh. So I just did what I was going to do. Notice the difference. The master looks at the wise servants and says, enter the joy I have for you. They understood something about that master's character that the foolish one did not. See that? I see that all over church sometimes. You have people who go, I don't really believe in a God who blesses, so I'm just not going to give. I don't think God really cares that much about my sins, so I'm just going to live this way. And the crazy thing is that one day the master will come back and you won't recognize him because it doesn't match the character that you've created in your own mind. Number two, look at this. The wise went to work, but the foolish became lazy. The foolish servant could not even be bothered to walk down to the bank. You see that? Here's how I envision it. The foolish servant gets the one talent. The master leaves. He looks in his backyard. There's a tree over there. Takes it, throws it into the ground, puts a little dirt on it, and forgets all about it. My friends, this is the American church. We've become lazy. What we've done is we have just bought into the lie that we just need to hunker down and hold on until Jesus comes back. And that is not what a disciple does. A disciple doesn't hide their talent. A disciple isn't lazy. A disciple doesn't just forget about it and think different things about God. Look at the third observation. The wise produced while the foolish was utterly unproductive. Now, this guy didn't lose the talent. He still had talent. He knew where the talent was. But the judgment was he was unproductive. Can I ask you a question? When was the last time you produced fruit for the kingdom of God? When was the last time you mentored somebody? When was the last time you talked about Christ to somebody? When was the last time you helped with a Bible study for kids? Or I remember the days, listen, I'm not that old, but I remember the days where I would see my parents come up and weep at the altar for me, and they were modeling behavior of what it looked like to follow Jesus. Yeah. I remember the conversations my parents had with me about God. I remember the youth pastors and the small group leaders and the Sunday school teachers who would spend countless of hours mentoring me. When was the last time? Because our master will come back one day. And he's not just looking for that talent. He's looking for what you've done with that talent. What are you doing? Now notice, it's not about how gifted you are. It's about what you're doing with what you've been given. Some of you can't sing. You don't need to be on the worship team. I can't sing, right? I'll put myself on mute and Donovan will sing. And as soon as I put the microphone on, if you're Donovan, like I'll be worshiping like this, like singing. And as soon as I put the microphone on to transition, I put it on mute or I turn it on and I shut my mouth because I don't want anybody to hear me sing. forever. God's not asking you to pastor a church or develop a crusade in Africa. What he's asking you to do is take the gifts and talents that you have and use them for the glory of God, for the expansion of his kingdom. That's what a disciple does. A disciple is productive. Don't be lazy. Get to work. You're required of it. If you're going to follow Jesus, it's a requirement. It's not optional.